She sent me 70 explicit photos with my husband, expecting tears. Instead, I made her go viral. I never imagined the moment my life cracked open would come wrapped in a notification ping. One message, no warning, just a name I barely recognized, and a file folder titled, "Thought You Should Know." Inside were 70 photos. Not blurry, not accidental, not deniable. 70 high-resolution, deliberately posed images of my husband, with another woman. She wasn't shy about her face. In fact, she seemed proud of it. Every frame was a taunt. Her legs draped across his lap, her lipstick smudged across his chest, her smile directed at the camera, like she knew I'd be watching. And I was. She sent them expecting to break me, to reduce me to tears. Maybe she imagined I'd scream, throw something, or beg him to stay. But what she never expected was the silence. The way I closed the app, folded the laundry, and poured myself a glass of wine. No tears, no breakdown, just an awakening. Before we continue, please subscribe. This isn't just about a home. It's about what happens when it stops feeling like one. She thought she'd won. She thought she had the power. But she gave it to me the moment she hit send. And what I did next? Let's just say, she won't be smiling for the camera anymore. Let me show you exactly how I made her go viral. Before we continue, please subscribe. It began on a Wednesday. The kind of ordinary midweek afternoon where the sky looks washed in soft light and the silence of the house is comforting, not empty. I had just returned from a meeting with a client, set my handbag on the marble counter, and kicked off my shoes. The house smelled faintly of lavender and lemon, my usual diffuser blend, and everything was in its place. I picked up my phone like I always did, expecting emails, maybe a text from Daniel asking if I wanted Thai for dinner. Instead, I saw her name, unknown, and beneath it, a single file. Thought you should know. I didn't open it right away. I stared at it for a long second, my thumb hovering, something tight pressing against my chest. Not panic, not dread. Just a deep, bone-level knowing. I've always had good instincts, but this wasn't instinct. This was confirmation of what I had suspected in pieces for over a year. The late nights, the sudden work trips, the way Daniel had stopped touching me like I was something sacred and started treating me like fine china gathering dust. I clicked. The folder opened. There were 70 photos. The first was innocent enough. Him sitting beside her at a beach bar. But then came the second, and the third, and by the fifth photo, they weren't pretending anymore. His hands were on her. Her tongue was on his neck. Her blouse was undone, her smile smug. In one image, she looked directly at the camera. Directly at me, it felt like. My breath didn't catch. My hands didn't shake. I felt something colder than heartbreak. Something quieter than rage. I felt clarity. Each image unfolded another piece of their story. I recognized the places. The vineyard where Daniel once took me for our anniversary. The hotel in New York where he said he was meeting investors. The leather seats of our SUV parked in the third stall of our garage. They hadn't just been careless. They'd been confident. Arrogant even. She had sent me the images like a trophy presentation. Here's what I've won, her eyes seemed to say. But the truth is, she hadn't won anything. Not yet. I studied every photo, not for pain, but for evidence. I took screenshots. I made duplicates. I created a new album labeled Archive. Not because I was plotting revenge. Not yet. But because something in me had shifted. I didn't feel like the victim. I didn't feel like the wife. I felt like the storm about to hit both their lives with the force of quiet dignity and undisguised precision. When I finished looking, I placed my phone face down, walked to the kitchen, and boiled water for tea. No screaming, no calls, no confrontation. because the game had just started. And unlike her, I never show my hand too soon. I didn't block her. That's what most women would have done. Delete the photos, block the number, crumble under the humiliation. But I wanted her to know I saw it. I wanted her to feel the silence pressing against her like a held breath. She was expecting chaos. She was waiting for a dramatic reaction, maybe a flurry of phone calls or a furious confrontation. But instead, I gave her stillness. I watched the message status turn to read, and I imagined her staring at her phone, confused that her bait hadn't worked. That was the first seed of doubt I wanted to plant. Daniel came home that evening like he always did, keys jingling, voice calling out casually. "Hey babe, I'm home." I wiped down the counter and smiled. "Welcome back." He kissed my cheek as if everything was normal. It was almost comical. The same lips that had kissed another woman in 70 photographs now pressed against my skin like a ritual. And I let him. Not because I forgave him, not because I didn't care, but because I needed him to stay comfortable. A man at ease always reveals more than one who feels cornered. Dinner was quiet. I asked him about his day. He lied with practiced ease, giving me a watered-down version of his afternoon. He said the board meeting had run long. He said traffic was terrible. He said he missed me. I nodded politely, carving into my salmon while the scent of his mistress's perfume still lingered faintly in his shirt collar. If he noticed the tightness in my jaw or the hollowness in my smile, he didn't show it. Maybe he didn't care. Maybe he truly believed he was untouchable, that I was too soft, too dignified, too in love to ever fight back. But I was watching everything now. The way he checked his phone under the table. The smirk that crept onto his face when he thought I wasn't looking. The way his hand trembled for a fraction of a second when I asked casually, "Are you still seeing that investor in New York?" He recovered quickly, nodded, and said, "Yes, next week." A lie wrapped in a blazer and expensive cologne. I smiled, excused myself, and went upstairs. In our bedroom, I pulled out the fireproof box beneath the bed. Inside were documents, our prenup, bank statements, copies of property deeds. I hadn't read them in years, but tonight I studied every clause, every signature. Not out of desperation, but preparation. If war had been declared, I would not enter it blindly. She wanted to rattle me. He wanted to deceive me. But I wasn't built to break. While they played games in secret, I prepared in silence. And that night, I slept soundly for the first time in months. By morning, the fog of betrayal had settled into something more precise. Not sorrow, not even anger. Just a sharpened sense of direction. I didn't need to scream to feel power moving beneath my skin. It was in the way I chose my outfit, a silk blouse in deep navy, pearls, hair swept back, not for him, but for the woman he thought he could break me for. If she was watching, I wanted her to see a woman not unraveling, but rising. While Daniel slept beside me, unaware that the calm he mistook for passivity was anything but, I dressed like a woman going to war with grace as her armor. Downstairs, I poured coffee and scrolled through her public social media. It was all there, gift-wrapped in arrogance. Her name was Sabrina, 29. A self-described lifestyle consultant with a grid of airbrushed selfies, iced lattes, and captions that read like passive-aggressive poetry. In her world, I was just the footnote. The bitter wife clinging to a man who had already moved on emotionally. But she was mistaken. I hadn't been left behind. I had stepped back, observed, and waited. And now that I had her full confession delivered in 70 digital chapters, I had more than heartbreak. I had leverage. Every photo she'd sent me was traceable. Metadata, timestamps, location pins, details she hadn't bothered to scrub. I pulled out my laptop and started connecting dots. She'd been bold, but she'd also been careless. I recognized a handbag in one image that Daniel had told me was a client gift. A lie, of course. I found it tagged in one of her posts with a caption that read, "When he spoils you without asking." I saved it. Then another post with her in the coat I'd seen on our credit card bill last month. Again, saved. The evidence wasn't just humiliating, it was valuable. And I wasn't going to waste it. I didn't call my lawyer. Not yet. That would come later. For now, I needed to study the battlefield. I needed to understand the psychology of the woman who thought I was weak enough to break, and the man who thought he could keep both lives without consequence. There was something almost laughable in their self-importance, as if I were just a character in their secret romance plotline, the bitter, aging obstacle they had to outsmart. But I wasn't the obstacle. I was the narrator, and they were giving me the perfect ending. Daniel wandered into the kitchen mid-scroll, hair tousled, yawning. "You're up early," he said, pouring himself coffee. I turned my screen slightly away from him and smiled. "Just catching up on a few things." He kissed my head and didn't even notice the photos glowing from my screen. They both thought I would sit quietly in my place. But what they failed to realize was that I had never been the woman who begged to be chosen. I was the one who decided how the story ends. I spent the next 3 days in character, smiling at dinner, laughing at the television, answering his text messages with soft emojis and warm replies. I gave him no reason to question my silence, no signal that I knew. Meanwhile, I continued collecting. Every lie he told became a thread, and I was weaving them into something airtight. I made note of the weekends he claimed to be on business trips and cross-referenced them with her travel posts. They had been in Paris together 2 months ago, not 30 minutes from the hotel he had booked in my name. She had posted a champagne toast from a rooftop with the caption, "Midnight kisses and messy promises." I found the charge for that rooftop bar on our joint credit card. He had used our anniversary reward points for that stay. The detail didn't sting, it clarified. Each discovery removed a layer of sentiment I had once wrapped around our marriage. I wasn't mourning love anymore. I was studying betrayal like a crime scene. And it amazed me how transparent they both were once I stopped looking through the lens of disbelief. She was predictable. Photos carefully angled to show designer bags, his wristwatch sliding into frame, and captions laced with poetic cruelty. She wasn't in love. She was documenting her conquest. And he? He was the kind of man who mistook performance for privacy. So sure of himself, so used to being believed. He didn't know that I had stopped listening to his words a long time ago. I had started watching his patterns instead. On Friday night, I told him I was heading to a spa retreat with some girlfriends. He didn't even blink. "Have fun, babe. You deserve it," he said, handing me my overnight bag like a doting husband. I kissed him, slowly, and whispered thank you. The retreat was fiction. I checked into a quiet suite downtown with floor-to-ceiling windows and brought everything I needed: my laptop, a burner phone, and 70 photographs that were about to serve a greater purpose. There, overlooking the city lights, I created an anonymous Instagram account. The bio was simple. Sometimes the truth speaks for itself. I didn't add names. I didn't post anything personal. Just one image to start. A cropped photo of him and her kissing in the back of our SUV. No caption. Just a date. Then another image. Then another. I blurred their faces slightly, just enough to stir curiosity but not clarity. The internet thrives on mystery, and I gave them just enough to dig. I used hashtags she often used. Within an hour, her followers began noticing. By the next morning, I had over 10,000 views and counting. She wanted to go public, so I gave her a stage. But this time, I was holding the spotlight. And it was only just beginning. By Sunday, the account had taken on a life of its own. The comment section was a wildfire of speculation. Influencer drama, cheating scandal, soft launch affair. Everyone had a theory, and no one had answers. I watched it unfold from the quiet of my hotel suite, sipping espresso with one leg folded beneath me, robe loosely tied, the city humming softly below. I had uploaded 5 more images overnight, each one escalating in intimacy, each one whispering a little louder. Still no names, still no faces, just blurred lips, tangled limbs, and timestamps that didn't lie. She noticed first. Of course she did. Narcissists always monitor their own reflection. Her cryptic Instagram story went up around noon. People are obsessed with tearing others down. Get a life. No one had tagged her. No one had mentioned her name. Yet somehow she knew. I smiled at the predictability of it. The guilt wasn't what made her react. It was the threat to her image. She didn't care that I knew. She cared that the world might find out before she could spin the narrative. I waited. Daniel, meanwhile, hadn't noticed a thing. He was at home, texting me good morning, telling me he missed me already. I replied sweetly, "Counting the minutes, love." He had no idea his face was now the background in a story watched by thousands. Because I never showed the full frame. Just enough to make people lean closer. Just enough to make her sweat. I wasn't rushing this. I wanted them to feel the tightening noose of anonymity slowly collapsing. Because the truth, when served at the right temperature, doesn't need to scream. It just burns. By evening, someone had done what I expected. They matched her watch in one of the photos to a recent image she posted. Then came her coat, her bracelet. Within an hour, the comments changed tone. "Is this Sabrina? That looks like her necklace." Check the March 14th post. Same room. The internet had entered its forensic phase. I didn't interfere. I didn't confirm or deny. I let her drown in the possibility that someone else had pulled the curtain open. She posted another story. A selfie with her lips pursed, captioned, "Unbothered." But her eyes gave her away. They were wide, tense, searching. I didn't need to expose her. I just had to let the cracks form. I posted one more image before logging off for the night. Her reflection in a hotel mirror, Daniel behind her, half blurred, hand resting where wedding rings should matter. Still no caption. Just a time. Just a place. The story wasn't over. But the audience had arrived. And they were hungry. She had made the first move. Now, I was dancing her into checkmate. Monday morning arrived with a different kind of quiet. Not the peaceful, easy kind, but the thick, charged silence of something coming undone beneath the surface. My phone lit up with messages from numbers I didn't recognize. Private accounts requesting to follow the anonymous page. Direct messages filled with guesses, outrage, and validation from strangers who didn't know they were becoming part of a carefully curated unraveling. I didn't reply to any of them. I just watched. The numbers kept climbing. 20,000, then 27. Comments multiplying with every hour. Someone had compiled the images into a video montage and set it to music. It was being shared in private Facebook groups, whispered about in WhatsApp chats. The internet, as it always does, had turned curiosity into currency. She cracked first. By noon, she made her account private, deleted 10 posts, changed her bio. Then she did something that told me everything I needed to know. She messaged me. Not through her number, but through a fake account. A throwaway profile with no photo, no name, and one short message. "You think you're smart?" I stared at the screen for a long moment, imagining her pacing somewhere, voice sharp, hands shaking. She was unraveling. And I hadn't said a word. She had gifted me 70 photos to cause pain. Instead, I was repurposing her cruelty into a masterpiece of poetic exposure. Daniel still hadn't noticed. Or if he had, he was in too deep to confront it. That evening over dinner, he told me he'd booked a surprise weekend trip for us next month. "Somewhere quiet," he said with a smile. I smiled back. "That sounds perfect." He kissed my hand, his thumb tracing the edge of my ring. That same hand had been in every image, clutching her waist, pulling down hotel sheets. And now here it was, reaching for me like nothing had changed. But everything had changed. After dinner, while he showered, I opened my laptop. One more post. This time, it was different. A video. Not long, just under 30 seconds. Her voice laughing, his voice joining in. A dimly lit hotel hallway, a hand gripping hers. Then the door closing. Still no faces. But the timestamp said enough. The date aligned perfectly with the weekend he'd told me he had a business trip in Atlanta. The caption? Just one word. Memories. By midnight, the video had been shared over 40,000 times. This wasn't revenge. It wasn't even about pain anymore. This was reclamation. She wanted me to suffer in silence. But I turned her game into a stage. And now the spotlight was exactly where it belonged. The morning after the video dropped, I found Daniel in the kitchen, humming as he stirred cream into his coffee. He looked relaxed, even cheerful, as if the world outside our glass-paneled windows wasn't slowly unraveling his secret. He offered me a cup, kissed the top of my head, and asked if I wanted to go out for dinner that evening. I told him I'd love that. My voice was smooth, my smile soft, but beneath it all, I was watching him. Not just watching, documenting. Every gesture, every lie, every moment he convinced himself I was still in the dark. He was performing stability, but the stage was burning, and he hadn't noticed the smoke. Across town, she was unraveling. Her silence was louder than any message. She had gone completely dark. No posts, no stories, no cryptic quotes about self-worth or misunderstood love. Just silence. I imagined her curled up on a pristine sofa, phone in hand, refreshing the account, watching the comments pile up. I didn't pity her. I didn't hate her either. What I felt was something sharper. Detachment. She had wanted to shame me, to take something sacred and mock it in broad daylight. But instead, she became a ghost, haunting her own story. By noon, I received a message from a mutual acquaintance, one of those women who smile too hard at parties and always know too much. "Have you seen what's going around? It's wild. Looks like someone's getting exposed big time. People think it's Sabrina." I replied simply, "I hadn't seen anything." Then I turned off my notifications and returned to the quiet. This wasn't about gossip. It was about timing. And I wasn't finished. I spent that afternoon preparing. I printed copies of the photos. I wrote down dates. I assembled everything like evidence in a courtroom, not to accuse, but to be ready. There's a difference between reacting and responding. One is emotional. The other is powerful. I was no longer reacting to betrayal. I was responding to a challenge. That night, we went to dinner. He chose an elegant French restaurant, candlelight flickering across the white tablecloth as he ordered wine and made jokes about work. I wore a black dress he had once called his favorite, and listened as he told stories with confident eyes and a steady smile. There was no sign of guilt, no hesitation, just a man who believed he was still in control. When he reached for my hand across the table, I let him take it. Because this was the last dinner of the life he thought we still shared. And while he toasted to us, I was already writing the next chapter, one where he no longer played the lead, and where I finally stopped pretending not to see. We returned home just after 10. Daniel slipped his jacket onto the coat rack and whistled as he walked toward the den, loosening his tie like a man completely at ease. I followed slowly, watching him disappear down the hallway, that familiar silhouette now foreign to me. Everything about him was the same. The way he patted his pockets for his phone, the way he dropped his keys into the ceramic bowl by the stairs. But something had shifted. Or maybe it was just me who had changed. I no longer looked at him through the eyes of a wife. I looked through the lens of a woman who had been underestimated for far too long. I went upstairs without a word, changed into my nightgown, and sat at my vanity brushing my hair in silence. Each stroke calmed me, centered me, reminded me who I was before the betrayal and who I had become because of it. I didn't feel rage. That would have been easier, cleaner. What I felt was colder. Calculation with the faintest taste of freedom. I had survived the storm, and now I stood on dry land, no longer drowning in what-ifs. He came up not long after and leaned against the doorframe with a soft smile. "Dinner was nice, wasn't it?" I nodded, meeting his gaze through the mirror. "Very." He moved behind me, placed his hands on my shoulders, and kissed the top of my head. I didn't flinch. I didn't pull away. I let the moment hang there, thick and ironic, the scent of his cologne clinging to the skin of a woman he thought still belonged to him. But I had already left. My body was here, yes, but my spirit had packed up days ago, taking with it the last remnants of loyalty. That night, while he slept beside me with one arm lazily draped across my waist, I stared at the ceiling and whispered the one word that had been forming on my tongue for days. Enough. Not aloud. Not yet. Just to myself. A declaration in the dark. Enough pretending. Enough protecting a man who wouldn't hesitate to humiliate me. Enough swallowing truths to keep a peace built on betrayal. I slipped quietly out of bed, careful not to wake him, and walked to my study. There, I pulled out the folder. Inside were the images, the messages, the timeline. My story, their shame, all arranged in chronological order. I slid it into a leather briefcase, then placed a sealed envelope on the desk, addressed to Daniel. It wasn't a confession. It was a mirror. A clean, cold reflection of everything he'd hoped to hide. I returned to bed and lay beside him as if nothing had changed. But the truth was, everything had. Because tomorrow, I would begin the process of leaving. And I would do it with my head high, my silence intact, and my power fully reclaimed. The next morning, I didn't linger. I moved through the house like it was a stage I had already performed on for the final time. I made coffee, folded the throw blanket on the couch, ran the dishwasher. All the little rituals of domestic life that once made me feel tethered now felt like a farewell tour. Daniel was in the shower, humming to himself, as if the life he'd so carefully fractured hadn't already started to collapse. I placed the envelope on his desk in the study. Cream stationery, gold-trimmed edges, and my handwriting, sharp, even, unmistakable. Inside was a note. Not an explosion, not a list of grievances or tear-stained accusations. Just a single sentence. I know everything, and so does the world. You may want to sit down before opening your browser. Beneath it, I had included a printed QR code that linked directly to the anonymous account. Every image, every post, every timestamp. All there, waiting. The stage had been set, the curtain drawn. I didn't wait for him to read it. I didn't need to see his face. That part wasn't for me. His reaction belonged to him, and to the woman who thought she had won. I was done being an audience to their show. I was writing something new. I grabbed my keys, stepped into my heels, and walked out the door without a backward glance. My suitcase was already in the trunk. I drove to my lawyer's office, windows down, wind pulling at the loose strands of my hair. I wasn't crying. I wasn't shaking. I felt light. Like every ounce of pain they had tried to feed me had burned away, and all that remained was clarity. The truth had been dragged into the light, and for the first time in months, I didn't feel like I was holding my breath. At the office, I handed over the folder. My lawyer, a calm, no-nonsense woman who had seen far worse than this, skimmed through the documents with raised eyebrows and the occasional slow nod. "This," she said finally, tapping the images with her pen, "is going to make things very simple." I didn't smile. I just nodded. That's the plan. We discussed the next steps: asset division, property ownership, the terms of our prenup, and I signed the papers with a steady hand. There was no trembling, no hesitation, just ink and intention. I wasn't leaving as a woman betrayed. I was leaving as a woman who had endured, waited, and then delivered her truth with precision. By the time Daniel opened the envelope, I was already gone. And by the time the media got hold of the story, I was already free. I didn't need revenge. I just needed him to know that the woman he dismissed as naive had played the long game, and she had won. It didn't take long for the phone to start ringing. Not mine, his. The calls came in waves, from board members, longtime friends, distant cousins, and PR consultants who had once praised his polished public image. They wanted answers. They wanted to know why his name was suddenly trending on platforms he didn't even know how to use. They wanted to understand how a man so respected, so put together, had managed to become the center of a scandal dripping in betrayal and arrogance. But Daniel had no script prepared for this. He had built his identity on control, on appearing noble even while sinning quietly. Now, there was no curtain to hide behind. I wasn't there to witness the unraveling in person, but I could imagine it in vivid detail. Him pacing in the study, tie loosened, hair askew, jaw clenched. The envelope still open on the desk, my handwriting like a wound across the page. His eyes darting from the printed photos to the Instagram account that refused to go away. Every post was still there. I hadn't taken down a single one. Why would I? The internet didn't forget. And neither did I. He didn't call me. That surprised me. No pleading message, no late-night apology laced with desperation. Maybe he knew there was nothing left to say. Maybe he still thought this would blow over. Men like him often believe their name is enough to smother a scandal. What he failed to realize was that his reputation wasn't just bruised, it was bleeding. By the second day, I received a message from an unknown number. I opened it, expecting threats or guilt, but it wasn't from Daniel. It was from her, Sabrina. Her words were exactly what I expected: defensive, venomous, and tinged with panic. "You had no right," she wrote. "This is harassment. I'll take legal action." I almost laughed. She had sent me 70 photos without consent, with intention to humiliate, and now she wanted to play victim. I didn't reply. She didn't deserve my words. The world was already speaking for me. The Instagram account passed 100,000 followers. Strangers were dissecting their affair like detectives in a courtroom. Someone had even created a TikTok series documenting the timeline of their relationship, complete with voiceovers and dramatic reenactments. I watched from a distance, detached, but observant. I wasn't fueling the fire. I had simply lit the first match and walked away. The flames did the rest. And through it all, I remained still. Not hiding. Not ashamed. Just free. What they had tried to bury me under had become the soil I grew from. And now, with the weight of secrets lifted, I finally remembered what peace felt like. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was mine. I spent the following week in a cottage by the sea, the kind of quiet place that doesn't ask questions. The waves offered no judgment, only rhythm. The mornings smelled of salt and coffee, and the nights were filled with the hush of wind threading through pine. I let the ocean rearrange my thoughts. Let the quietness of the shore strip away the residue of their chaos. No one here cared who I was. No one here looked at me with pity or curiosity. I was just a woman with a suitcase, a story, and silence that no longer suffocated but soothed. Back in the city, the consequences were catching up with them. Daniel had released a statement, short and vague, filled with the usual language: deep regret, personal matters, request for privacy. It fooled no one. His board was furious. A lucrative deal fell through. Sponsors withdrew. The family name, once polished and untouchable, now circulated as a cautionary tale. And Sabrina? She had vanished from social media entirely. No final post, no parting words. Just a sudden absence where a loud presence used to be. Her followers mourned the loss of their favorite curated love story, without ever realizing they were never meant to be part of the truth. I watched it all from my wooden deck, barefoot, sweater wrapped around me, a warm mug in my hands. Not gleeful, just settled. I hadn't orchestrated a takedown. I'd told the truth. They had written the script. I had simply turned the lights on. One morning, my phone buzzed. A message from an old friend I hadn't spoken to in years. Saw the story. I just want you to know. I'm proud of you. I didn't reply right away. I just sat with the weight of those words, how foreign and freeing they felt. Proud of me. Not for staying. Not for keeping the peace. But for walking away with my dignity intact and my voice finally unmuted. Daniel still hadn't reached out. I think part of him believed this was temporary, that time would smooth over the wreckage and I'd return, softer, forgiving, willing to pick up the shattered glass and rebuild something already rotten. But he didn't understand me. He never had. Because this wasn't a chapter break. It was the end of the book. I journaled most nights, not to relive, but to release. Each sentence was a farewell to the version of me that had bent over backwards to preserve a marriage built on lies. I didn't need closure from him. I had written my own. And on the seventh night, as the tide reached a little higher on the shore and the stars blinked over the water like quiet applause, I realized something. Peace isn't loud. It doesn't arrive with fanfare. It simply comes when you've told your truth, and you're no longer afraid of who hears it. I returned to the city on a Thursday. The air felt different, thinner somehow, like the oxygen itself had shifted in my absence. Or maybe it was just me. I walked into my apartment, my real home, the one I had kept tucked away like a secret sanctuary. Everything was untouched. The polished floors, the linen drapes, the faint scent of jasmine from the diffuser I'd set before I left. Here, there were no ghosts, no reminders of betrayal pressed into furniture or caught in the corners of picture frames. Just space, light, peace that didn't have to be earned or negotiated. The first thing I did was open the windows. Let the breeze run through every room like a blessing. I unpacked slowly, not because I was tired, but because there was no longer any reason to rush. Time no longer felt like something slipping through my fingers. It was mine again. Later that evening, I sat on the balcony with a glass of wine and opened the envelope I'd mailed to myself before leaving the cottage. Inside was a copy of the letter I'd written to Daniel. I reread it, not to relive the pain, but to remind myself of the strength it took to write every word. There was no bitterness in it, just truth, clear and clean. A mirror he could no longer avoid. I had chosen not to publish it, not to share it with the world. Some things are better left between the guilty and the girl who walked away. The account still existed, though I hadn't posted in days. Strangers continued to dissect every frame, every image, turning speculation into saga. It was no longer mine. It belonged to the echo of a story people didn't want to stop telling. And that was fine. I had said what I needed to say, and now I was done speaking. Let the internet do what it does. I had no interest in managing the aftermath. I had survived the storm and didn't owe anyone a play-by-play of how I dried off. My phone vibrated once. A new message. From him. "Margaret, please. Can we talk?" I stared at the screen for a long time. The plea was thin, cautious, almost as if he knew he'd already lost the right to ask. I didn't respond. I wouldn't. I had said everything in silence, in walking away, in holding my head high while the world watched him spiral. Talking would imply that there was still something left to salvage. There was nothing. I closed the message, turned my phone face down, and watched the sun set behind the skyline. For the first time in a long while, I felt like myself again. Not a wife, not a victim, not a woman diminished by someone else's decisions. Just Margaret, complete, and at last, truly free. A week passed, then another, and with each day the silence from him grew louder. Not the silence of peace, but of realization, the kind that arrives when the storm has cleared and the damage can no longer be ignored. I imagined him walking through that house without me, passing the spaces I used to fill with warmth, steadiness, quiet grace. I wondered if he noticed how cold it all felt without someone holding the center together. Men like Daniel often don't feel the absence immediately. They mistake it for space. They convince themselves it's temporary. Until the echo settles in. Until no one is there to pretend for them anymore. I didn't speak his name. Not to friends, not to myself. I had removed him from the language of my life. Not out of pettiness, but preservation. What existed now was distance. Not just physical, but emotional, spiritual. The kind that happens when someone shows you exactly who they are, and you choose to believe them the first time. His betrayal had tried to rename me, tried to reduce me, but all it did was reveal me, to myself. One afternoon, I received a package. No return address, just a thick envelope with my name scrawled in rushed handwriting I recognized instantly. I sat with it for an hour before opening it. Not out of fear, but a strange curiosity. Inside were printed photographs. Our wedding day, a dinner in Florence, a birthday card I'd once written to him, folded neatly beside a note that said, "I never meant to hurt you." It would have been touching, maybe even redemptive, if it hadn't arrived weeks too late. If it hadn't come wrapped in nostalgia instead of accountability. The pictures were meant to make me feel something, to draw me back into the softness of before. But they only reminded me of everything I had already outgrown. Love, without respect, becomes a weapon. And no photograph could rewrite the truth of what he did with mine. I placed the envelope on the table, poured myself a glass of water, and stood at the window. Outside, the world moved as it always had. People walking, children laughing, the hum of life not waiting for anyone to catch up. I smiled softly, realizing I wasn't waiting either. Healing hadn't come all at once. It arrived in moments, in choosing not to reply, in waking up without a knot in my chest, in no longer wondering what she had that I didn't. The answer, of course, was nothing. He hadn't chosen her because she was better. He had chosen her because he was smaller. I folded the photographs, put them in a drawer I rarely opened, and went back to my life. Not the old life, but one built on truth instead of illusion. A life where I no longer carried someone else's secrets, only my own freedom. It was a quiet Sunday when I saw her again. Not in person, but in passing. Her face flickering across my screen in a low-resolution video someone had reposted. A grainy clip from what looked like a cafe. Sabrina, sitting alone, sunglasses on indoors, hair pulled back tightly like she was trying to erase the version of herself that had once looked so smug in those photos. The caption was simple: "Is this her?" The comments were split between speculation and mockery. I didn't feel satisfaction watching her like that. I felt distance, the kind that comes when someone who once seemed like the storm itself now looks barely capable of a breeze. She had become exactly what she never thought she would be: forgettable. Not the villain of the story, not even a cautionary tale. Just a woman who gambled with someone else's marriage and lost more than she expected. The fame she wanted had arrived, but not in the form she imagined. And now she was running from a spotlight she used to crave. It was poetic, in a quiet, unremarkable way. That evening, I walked to the bookstore down the street. The air was cool, and the city had settled into that soft hum it only knows on weekends. I browsed for a while, letting my fingers trace the spines of novels I hadn't had the space to read during my marriage. I wasn't looking for anything in particular. I just wanted to exist without narrative. No plot twist, no heartbreak, no climax. Just presence. The woman behind the register complimented my earrings. I smiled, thanked her, and for a moment I realized how rarely I had accepted kindness without suspicion. That was what betrayal does. It teaches you to brace yourself, even in safety. But lately, I was learning how to receive again. Not just kindness, but stillness, joy, peace. It didn't arrive loudly. It crept in quietly, like breath. When I returned home, I made tea and watched the lights flicker in the windows across the street. Somewhere in that view, people were holding hands, making dinner, or maybe arguing about something small. Life was happening. And mine, finally, was too. Not centered around a man's approval. Not clouded by someone else's decisions. Just mine. Entirely, beautifully mine. I didn't need to post another photo. I didn't need to respond to Sabrina. The world had drawn its own conclusions, and I had no interest in correcting them. Let them wonder. Let them speculate. I had already lived the truth, and that was enough. There was no victory dance, no closing scene. Just me, in a room that no longer carried the scent of lies. Me, quietly and steadily choosing myself, without any need to apologize. For the first time in a long while, that was enough. A month passed, then another. Life didn't rush to congratulate me, but it welcomed me back gently. There were no fireworks, no grand revelations, just the quiet unfolding of routine that began to feel like home again. I started waking up without dread. I went entire days without thinking of him. My name sounded like mine again when I spoke it out loud. Healing didn't arrive as a dramatic crescendo. It came as consistency. The morning light through the curtains, the warmth of tea in my hands, the silence that used to feel heavy now resting against me like a soft blanket. I ran into an old acquaintance at a gallery opening one evening. She tilted her head slightly, as if trying to decide how far she could push the curiosity without sounding obvious. "I heard things ended, dramatically," she said carefully. I smiled, serene. "Things ended," I replied. That was all I offered. She wouldn't get the story, not from me. Let people speculate. Let them fill in the blanks with whatever narrative suited them. I had no desire to retell the pain or explain the process. My story belonged to me now. Not to whispers, not to gossip, and certainly not to anyone who hadn't walked with me through the fire. Later that night, I passed a familiar restaurant, the one where Daniel and I had celebrated our 5th anniversary. I paused across the street, not out of sadness, but to acknowledge that version of me. The woman who sat at a corner table in a burgundy dress, toasting a future she didn't know was already breaking beneath her. I didn't pity her. I didn't feel foolish. She had loved with sincerity. She had believed. and she had survived. I whispered a quiet thank you to her and kept walking. Some ghosts deserve kindness, not shame. At home, I lit a candle and turned on soft music. I was learning to enjoy my own company again. The kind of enjoyment that isn't performative, not something done to fill the void, but a genuine appreciation of solitude. I danced barefoot in the kitchen, slow and uncoordinated, but real. That night, I journaled a single sentence before bed. I am no longer trying to be what I was before him. I am becoming what I was always meant to be. The pain didn't disappear completely. Some days it flickered back in small ways. A scent, a song, a memory that arrived uninvited. But it no longer ruled me. It no longer rewrote the way I saw myself. What they took from me was real. But what I reclaimed could never be taken again. Because I had stopped waiting for closure and started living like the chapter had already ended. Quietly, powerfully, unapologetically. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I realized I hadn't thought of either of them all day. I was in the middle of rearranging the books in my study, a task I'd been meaning to do for months, but had always postponed in the haze of emotional survival. There was no grand emotion tied to the realization. Just a pause, a blink, a quiet acknowledgement that I had gone an entire day without their names echoing in my mind. No memories tugging at the corners. No silent arguments with people who weren't in the room. Just me, alphabetizing novels and humming to myself as sunlight spilled across the floor. Peace doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it simply shows up in the spaces where pain used to live. I found an old photo tucked inside one of the books. Daniel and I at a vineyard, arms around each other, sun on our faces. I looked at it for a long time, waiting for the familiar wave of sadness or fury or disbelief. But none of it came. I saw two people who once believed something beautiful, however briefly. A version of love that had been real in the moment, even if it didn't survive the truth. I didn't rip the photo up. I didn't hold on to it either. I placed it gently in a drawer, not out of longing, but because not everything needs to be destroyed in order to be left behind. That night, I took myself out to dinner. A small place tucked into a quiet side street, where the waiter smiled without recognition, and the candle on my table flickered like it knew the rhythm of my thoughts. I ordered wine, something bold, something red, and toasted. Not to survival, but to transformation. There's a difference. Survival is clinging to the edge. Transformation is choosing to climb out and never look back. A couple sat at the next table, laughing softly, her hand resting on his. I watched them without envy. I didn't measure myself against their moment. I didn't ache for what I lost. I had stopped seeing love as a prize and started seeing it as a mirror. Something that should reflect safety, joy, truth. And if it doesn't, then it's not love. It's illusion. When I walked home, the air smelled like night-blooming jasmine and something warm from a nearby bakery. I moved through the streets slowly, taking in the world without the heaviness I'd carried for so long. My story hadn't ended in bitterness. It hadn't made me hard. It had made me aware, awake. And in that awareness, I found something far more valuable than revenge. I found wholeness. And it had nothing to do with being chosen. It came from choosing myself and never needing their apology to feel complete. It was sometime in early spring when the final ripple reached me. A magazine cover. One of those lifestyle spreads with too much lighting and too little truth. Daniel stood beside a new woman, smiling with that same curated charm, dressed in navy like he was still trying to convince the world of his composure. The headline was predictable. Something about resilience, about moving forward. I didn't buy the magazine. I didn't need to. I saw everything I needed to in that glossy, posed frame. The same man, repeating the same script, only with a different co-star. She looked younger, delicate in the way PR teams adore, safe, pretty, non-threatening. I wondered if she knew who she was standing next to. I wondered if she'd already ignored the small warnings her gut had whispered. I didn't feel anger, just confirmation. People rarely change when they've never had to sit in the consequences of their own destruction. He had moved on not because he had grown, but because the mirror I'd held up was too honest for him to face. Men like Daniel don't seek healing. They seek applause for surviving the mess they created, hoping the world forgets the details while they rehearse redemption. I closed the tab and made tea. Chamomile, with honey. My Sunday routine. No drama. No shaking hands. Just a quiet nod to how far I'd come from the woman who once would have studied that article. Heart racing, trying to find hidden meanings between the words. That version of me would have compared, would have questioned. Now, I had nothing to prove, and even less to chase. Later that day, I met a friend at a park cafe. She asked if I'd seen the cover. I smiled and said yes, then gently changed the subject. Not out of avoidance, but because there was nothing left to analyze. That chapter wasn't just closed. It was archived, labeled, filed. I had done the work, faced the wreckage, rebuilt myself from the inside out, and no photograph, no magazine, no well-polished smile could undo that. As we sipped our drinks beneath the budding trees, laughter floated in from a nearby picnic. A child chased a kite across the grass, and somewhere, a dog barked at the wind. Life kept moving, and so did I. When I returned home that evening, I passed the mirror in my hallway. For a moment, I paused. Not to adjust anything, not to check for flaws, but simply to see myself. Fully, unapologetically. The woman who had been shattered and still chose softness. The woman who had been betrayed and still believed in truth. The woman who had lost something, but never herself. I looked into my own eyes and quietly said, "Well done." Healing isn't always about reaching a clear end. Sometimes it's simply finding peace within yourself and understanding that you don't need anyone else's idea of closure, just your own. The call came just after midnight. I wasn't asleep. I had been reading, curled under a throw blanket with a novel half finished and a candle burning low on the table. When I saw his name flash across the screen, I didn't feel dread, just a mild, almost clinical curiosity. It had been months, long enough for the wounds to scab over, for my name to fade from his daily thoughts, or so I assumed. I let the phone ring, watched it in silence. When it stopped, I stared at the dark screen for a moment longer, then returned to my book. 3 pages later, it rang again. This time, I answered. His voice was smaller than I remembered, the kind of tone people use when they've run out of pride, but still can't quite let go of control. He asked how I was. I told him I was well. He paused, as if the calmness in my voice surprised him. He spoke about regrets, about the story getting out of hand, about how everything spiraled and how somehow he never thought it would end the way it did. He used words like mistake and weakness, as if polishing the edges of betrayal would make it sting less. I let him talk. I owed him nothing, but silence can be its own kind of grace. And then he asked the question I knew was coming. "Do you think we could ever talk? Really talk?" I closed my book slowly, my finger holding the page. "No," I said. Not with anger, not with cruelty, just finality. He didn't argue. He just breathed on the line, the way people do when they've finally heard what they already knew. I told him I forgave him, not for his sake, but for mine. That I didn't wish him harm, that I wasn't bitter. But I had rebuilt a life from the wreckage he left behind, and there was no door left open for him to walk through. Forgiveness, I had learned, was not the same as return. He whispered a thank you, and then he was gone. I sat there for a while, phone resting on my lap, the flame of the candle flickering low. There was no shaking, no tears, just a quiet sort of peace that settled into my chest like a truth finally spoken aloud. Closure didn't come from his apology. It came from my refusal to need it. From understanding that healing doesn't mean reopening wounds to prove you've survived. It means knowing when to close the book and place it back on the shelf. So I did it. I blew out the candle, got up, and switched off the lights. I slept through the night without any dreams of him. When morning came, I felt lighter. Not because he called, but because I didn't respond with my heart. Some stories don't end with fireworks. They end in quiet. In the hush after you've chosen yourself. Not out of anger, but out of clarity. I didn't win because I exposed them. I didn't win because I made her go viral, or because the world finally saw what I had been living through in silence. I won because I walked away without looking back. Because I stopped waiting for apologies, for explanations, for redemption from people who were never capable of offering it. She thought 70 photos would break me. He thought silence would protect him. But what neither of them understood is that a woman who rebuilds herself doesn't return to the rubble. She creates something stronger, softer, wiser. Mine was not a story of revenge. It was a story of reclamation, of peace that wasn't handed to me, but claimed with every boundary I held, every truth I spoke, and every tear I didn't let define me. So if you're watching this and you've been there, betrayed, abandoned, underestimated, let this be your reminder. You don't have to scream to be powerful. Sometimes, the quietest exits are the ones that echo the loudest. And I left without a sound. Thanks for spending time with this story. If it resonated with you, don't keep it to yourself. Someone else may need to hear it too. Watch another real-life journey by clicking on the left, and subscribe so you never miss what comes next. This story may have ended, but the message lingers. For more raw and real moments like this, click on the left and subscribe to walk alongside more women finding their strength. Healing Take.